The most powerful moves in history weren't made with swords or armies, they were made with whispers. Influence often works best when it hides in plain sight, when words slip through back doors of power, when silence bends entire rooms, when absence speaks louder than presence. These are the subtle tactics that shaped empires, toppled rulers, and rewrote history without anyone realizing they'd been persuaded. Tonight, we'll uncover 50 of these hidden strategies, exploring how the smallest gestures, an empty chair, a pause too long, a gift without strings, shifted the fate of nations. And it begins with the tactic that crowned rulers without a single battle. The whispered crown. A messenger arrives at dawn. No fanfare, no royal proclamation, just a quiet word in the right ear at the right moment. The king is dead, but the city sleeps on, unaware. By the time the sun rises fully, a new ruler sits on the throne. How did power change hands so smoothly that nobody noticed? This is the art of the whispered crown. History's greatest power shifts often happened not through grand battles or public declarations, but through carefully placed words in darkened rooms. A suggestion here, a rumor there. The gentle guidance of public opinion until what seemed impossible yesterday feels inevitable today. Consider how Augustus became Rome's first emperor. He never declared himself king. Instead, he accumulated titles slowly, each one seeming reasonable, necessary even. The Senate voted him these powers willingly, feeling they were making wise decisions. Only later did they realize they had handed absolute authority to one man, piece by careful piece. The most effective influence never feels like influence at all. It feels like discovery, like coming to your own conclusions. The skilled manipulator becomes invisible, their hands so light that those being guided believe they are walking their chosen path. They plant seeds of thought and let others believe the harvest was their own idea. What makes this so powerful is our deep need to feel autonomous. We resist being told what to do, but we embrace what we think we decided ourselves. The whispered crown exploits this fundamental aspect of human psychology. It gives us the illusion of choice while subtly shaping the options we see. Perhaps the most unsettling part is how natural it feels. When influence is done masterfully, it doesn't create resistance because it doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like wisdom, like the natural order of things falling into place. And in the quiet moments, when you notice how your own thoughts have shifted without you remembering exactly when or why, you might wonder whose whisper first planted the seed that grew into your certainty. Caesar's last gift. They surrounded him with knives, but Caesar's most powerful weapon wasn't steel. It was a simple piece of parchment, a will that would reshape an empire, written not in blood but in calculated generosity. Even dying, Julius Caesar understood something his assassins had forgotten. The dead can still give gifts. In that final document, Caesar left money to every citizen of Rome. Not just the wealthy, not just the supporters, but everyone. 300 sestertii each. Enough to buy several months of grain. To a common Roman, this wasn't just money. It was proof that the murdered dictator had cared about them personally. The senators who killed Caesar thought they were saving the republic. They imagined crowds cheering their noble deed. Instead, they faced a city full of people who suddenly felt they had lost a generous patron. The assassination transformed from liberation into theft. Caesar had stolen victory from his own death. This is the psychology of posthumous generosity. When someone dies, we judge their entire life by their final acts. Caesar knew this. He crafted his will like a master storyteller, ensuring the last chapter would rewrite everything that came before. His cruelty was forgotten. His ambition became vision. His dictatorship became care for the common people. The gift carried deeper implications too. By leaving money to every citizen, Caesar was saying something profound about Roman identity. Not just that he loved Rome, but that he saw every person as worthy of his attention. The rich and poor, the supporter and the critic, all were equal recipients of his final kindness. His assassins had planned for political resistance, but they found themselves fighting something more dangerous. They were fighting gratitude. People don't easily turn against someone who has given them something valuable, especially someone who can never ask for anything in return. Years later, when Augustus rose to power claiming to be Caesar's heir, he carried with him not just a famous name, but the memory of that final gift. The people remembered who had cared for them, and in their gratitude, an empire was born. The silence between words. She pauses, just a heartbeat longer than expected. In that tiny gap, the entire conversation shifts. The listener leans forward unconsciously, hanging on the next word with sudden intensity. What was about to be dismissed becomes urgent, all because of what wasn't said. This is the power of strategic silence. Not the absence of words, but their careful withholding. History's most skilled communicators understood that what you don't say can be more persuasive than what you do. The pause becomes a question mark in the listener's mind, demanding to be filled. Winston Churchill mastered this technique during his wartime speeches. He would build to a crucial point, then stop, the silence stretched just long enough for the audience to feel the weight of the moment, to lean into the gap he had created. When he finally spoke again, his words landed with the force of revelation. The silence works because our minds cannot tolerate empty space. We are meaning-making creatures. When someone stops speaking at a significant moment, we instinctively begin filling that gap with our own thoughts, our own fears, our own hopes. And once we have filled the silence ourselves, we become invested in whatever comes next. Ancient negotiators knew this secret. They would present their offer, then fall completely silent. No justification, no additional persuasion, just quiet waiting. The other party, uncomfortable with the emptiness, would often begin negotiating against themselves, talking their way into accepting terms they might have otherwise rejected. The technique creates a kind of psychological vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum, but so does the human mind. We rush to fill silence with meaning, often more meaning than was originally intended. The pause becomes pregnant with possibility, heavy with implications that the speaker never actually made. But perhaps the most profound silence is the one that follows a truth too difficult to speak. When words fail, when the moment is too large for language, silence becomes the most honest response. And in that honesty, influence finds its purest form. Mirrors in the palace. Every surface gleamed, not with gold or jewel, but with reflection. The Palace of Versailles held more mirrors than any building in human history. Nobles would walk its halls and see themselves everywhere, repeated infinitely in polished glass. But Louis XIV's mirrors served a purpose far beyond decoration. When courtiers looked into those endless reflections, they saw not just their own faces, but their place in the king's world. Every mirror reminded them that they were being watched, that their appearance mattered, that they were part of a grand spectacle where image was everything. The mirrors made them conscious of themselves as performers. This is the psychology of constant observation. When people know they are being seen, they begin to police their own behavior. They become their own guards, adjusting their expressions, their posture, their words to fit what they believe is expected. The mirror becomes a tool of control, more effective than any law. The Hall of Mirrors served another function too. It created a sense of infinite space, of grandeur beyond measure. Visitors would walk through and feel dwarfed, not just by the room's size, but by its endless multiplication of itself. They were reminded of their own smallness in the face of royal power that seemed to extend in all directions. But the most subtle influence came from what the mirrors revealed about human nature. Courtiers became obsessed with their reflections, spending fortunes on elaborate clothing and perfect manners. They competed to be the most polished reflection of royal taste. Without realizing it, they were transforming themselves into extensions of the king's will. The mirrors taught them to see themselves through royal eyes. What would the king think of this gesture? How would this dress appear in the candlelight of the evening's performance? They internalized the royal perspective until it became their own inner voice, guiding their choices even when no one else was watching. In this way, Louis XIV achieved something remarkable. He made his courtiers complicit in their own control. They policed themselves, transformed themselves, competed to become perfect reflections of his vision. The mirrors didn't just show them their faces, they showed them who they had agreed to become. The weight of empty chairs. The meeting room held 12 chairs, but only 8 people arrived. The 4 empty seats sat like silent accusations, their absence speaking louder than any words. Who was missing? Why weren't they here? The empty chairs became the most powerful presence in the room. This is the influence of strategic absence. Sometimes the most effective way to shape a conversation is not to join it. The missing person becomes a ghost in the discussion, their unexpressed opinions weighing on every decision. People begin to wonder, to second-guess, to fill the silence with their own assumptions about what the absent party might think. Stalin understood this technique perfectly. He would summon his inner circle to meetings, then arrive hours late or not at all. The assembled officials would sit in tense speculation, trying to guess his mood, his intentions, his current favor or displeasure. His absence controlled them more effectively than his presence ever could. The empty chair creates a psychological void that demands to be filled. Meeting participants begin speaking to the absent person, imagining their responses, anticipating their objections. The missing individual gains a kind of supernatural influence, present in every decision despite their physical absence. In families, the empty chair at dinner can reshape entire conversations. The missing person's opinions echo through every topic, their imagined reactions influencing what is said and what is carefully avoided. Their absence becomes a form of presence more powerful than participation. The technique works because our minds are relational. We think not just about what we believe, but about how our beliefs will be received by others. When those others are absent, we imagine their responses, often giving them more power in our thinking than they would have if they were actually present to defend their positions. But the empty chair carries deeper psychological weight. It reminds us of loss, of the fragility of presence, of all the voices that could be here but aren't. In that reminder lies both sadness and power. The absent person becomes idealized, their imagined words carrying the weight of all unspoken possibilities. Bread before the storm. Rome was hungry, not starving. Not yet, but the grain ships were late again. Rumors spread through the narrow streets like smoke. Then, just as unrest began to simmer, the warehouses opened. Bread for everyone. Free, fresh, abundant. The crowd's anger transformed into gratitude in a single afternoon. This was not charity. This was calculation. Roman emperors understood that revolution starts in empty stomachs, but loyalty grows from full ones. The bread wasn't just food. It was a message. Your emperor provides. Your emperor cares. Your emperor stands between you and hunger. The timing was everything. Relief has little value when given to the content, but becomes precious beyond measure when offered to the desperate. The emperors would sometimes allow shortages to develop, not through cruelty, but through careful orchestration. Only when the people truly felt need would the solution appear. This is the psychology of manufactured crisis and timely rescue. First, create or allow a problem to develop. Let people feel vulnerable, uncertain, afraid, then appear as the solution, the protector, the provider of relief. The gratitude that follows is deeper than any earned through simple generosity because it is born from genuine need. The bread served another purpose too. It created dependency. Romans began to expect their daily ration, to plan their lives around its reliable provision. They became invested in the stability of the system that fed them. Revolution meant risk of losing not just political freedom, but daily sustenance. Modern leaders still use this ancient formula. The crisis appears, people feel helpless, then the leader steps forward with the solution. The rescued population doesn't just feel grateful, they feel chosen, protected, special. They begin to identify with their rescuer because their survival depended on that intervention. But perhaps the most subtle aspect was how the bread changed people's relationship with their own agency. They stopped asking why the grain ships were late in the first place. They focused instead on their gratitude for the rescue, forgetting that those who provide relief from crisis are often the same ones who allowed the crisis to develop. The art of forgotten names. She remembered everyone, not just their faces or their titles, but their children's names, their birthdays, their small personal troubles. When the Duchess spoke to you, it felt like you were the only person in the world who mattered. This wasn't natural charm. It was a carefully cultivated system of influence, more powerful than any army. Catherine de' Medici kept detailed records, not of state finances or military strength, but of personal information: who was in debt, who was in love, who had family problems, who harbored secret ambitions. She turned memory into a weapon, using intimate knowledge to make others feel understood, valued, and ultimately obligated. The technique works because being remembered is one of our deepest human needs. When someone recalls details about your life that even you had forgotten you shared, it creates a profound sense of connection. You feel seen, acknowledged, important. This feeling generates loyalty more effectively than any reward or threat. But the art goes deeper than simple memory. It's about making people feel that their personal struggles matter to someone in power. Catherine would ask about sick relatives, remember wedding anniversaries, inquire about problems she had heard mentioned months earlier. Each interaction reinforced the message that she cared about them as individuals. This creates a psychological debt that is difficult to repay. When someone in authority shows genuine interest in your personal life, you begin to feel obligated to support their interests in return. The relationship becomes reciprocal in your mind, even though the power balance remains completely unequal. The forgotten name technique also serves as subtle intimidation. If someone remembers this much about you, what else do they know? What other details about your life are stored in their files? The personal attention becomes both flattering and slightly unnerving, creating a complex emotional response that keeps people off balance. Ancient Chinese diplomats perfected this approach, keeping extensive records of foreign officials' families, preferences, and personal histories. When negotiations began, they would demonstrate this knowledge through casual references and personal inquiries, establishing psychological advantage before any formal discussions commenced. The most skilled practitioners make it seem effortless, as if their remarkable memory is simply a natural gift rather than a calculated strategy. And in that performance lies the true artistry of influence. The target feels special, chosen, understood, never suspecting they are simply another entry in a carefully maintained database of human vulnerabilities. Shadows cast by light. The spotlight burns bright on center stage, but the real power moves in the darkness just beyond its reach. While the audience watches the illuminated performance, the puppeteer's hands work unseen, pulling strings that dance the marionettes through their scripted roles. The light creates the shadow, and in that shadow, influence finds its home. Every powerful leader needs their shadow self. The public figure who speaks of peace while someone else wages the necessary wars. The politician who champions ethics while their campaign manager handles the dirty work. The corporate leader who maintains plausible deniability while subordinates execute questionable strategies. This is the architecture of power projection. The light and shadow work together, each making the other possible. The public figure can remain clean because someone else handles the stains. The shadow operator can work effectively because they remain invisible, protected by the bright glare cast on their principal. Henry Kissinger perfected this dance during his years as Secretary of State. Nixon took the public blame for controversial decisions, while Kissinger operated in the diplomatic shadows, building relationships and making deals that would have been impossible if conducted in full view. The light of criticism fell on the president, while the real architect of policy worked unseen. But the shadow serves another purpose. It creates mystery, and mystery generates power. When people cannot see all the mechanisms at work, they imagine more than actually exists. The hidden influence becomes larger in their minds than it is in reality. Fear of the unseen grows stronger than fear of the visible. The technique requires careful balance. Too much light exposes everything, making manipulation obvious and resistance likely. Too much shadow creates paranoia and suspicion that can backfire. The art lies in finding the perfect proportion, enough illumination to seem transparent while maintaining enough darkness to preserve operational freedom. Perhaps the most sophisticated aspect is how the shadow and light protect each other. Attacks on the public figure cannot touch the shadow operator, while accusations against the hidden influence can be dismissed as conspiracy thinking by pointing to the visible, accountable leadership. In this way, power learns to exist in two places simultaneously, like a quantum particle that occupies multiple states until observed. And in that duality lies both its strength and its fundamental instability. The language of colors. Red meant danger, but not the red you expected. In the Forbidden City, common people were forbidden to wear the emperor's shade of yellow. Not any yellow, but the specific golden hue that caught sunlight like captured fire. Those who dared to don the imperial color faced death, not for rebellion, but for speaking a language they weren't authorized to use. Color was China's silent vocabulary of power. Each shade carried meaning. Each combination told a story about status, authority, and social position. The emperor's court could read the hierarchy at a glance, understanding who held favor, who was rising, who was falling, all through the careful language of silk and dye. This is the psychology of symbolic control. When you control what people can wear, say, or display, you control how they think about themselves and their place in the world. The color restrictions weren't just about fashion. They were about identity, about making social order visible and unquestionable. Purple held similar power in the Roman Empire. The dye came from thousands of murex shells, making it more valuable than gold. Only the emperor could wear true purple. Senators were permitted a stripe of it on their togas, but full purple remained forbidden. The color became so associated with imperial power that born to the purple still means royal birth today. The brilliance of color control lies in its subtlety. People internalize these restrictions without conscious thought. They see the forbidden shade and automatically think of authority, of power they cannot touch. The color itself becomes a form of psychological conditioning, creating automatic responses of deference and respect. But colors work deeper than conscious symbolism. They trigger emotional and physiological responses we cannot control. Red increases heart rate and creates urgency. Blue promotes calm and trust. Gold suggests wealth and permanence. By controlling access to certain colors, rulers were literally controlling the emotional responses they could generate in others. In medieval Europe, sumptuary laws dictated not just who could wear purple, but who could afford certain blues, specific reds, particular patterns. These weren't fashion rules. They were social control mechanisms that made inequality visible and seemingly natural. The most insidious aspect is how these color hierarchies feel inevitable once established. People begin to believe that certain colors naturally belong to certain classes, that the visual order reflects some deeper truth about human worth and social position. Steps that echo nowhere. The hallway stretched for exactly 137 paces. Every visitor to the palace counted them unconsciously, their footsteps echoing in the vast space while guards stood motionless at regular intervals. By the time they reached the throne room, petitioners felt small, tired, and overwhelmed by the journey itself. This was architecture as psychology. The long approach wasn't just impressive, it was transformative. With each step, visitors shed their confidence, their sense of personal importance, their belief that they belonged in this place of power. The walk became a ritual of diminishment, preparing them to submit before they ever saw the king. Cathedral builders understood this same principle. The impossibly high ceilings, the long nave stretching toward the altar, the play of light and shadow designed to make humans feel their own smallness in the face of divine grandeur. Architecture was teaching theology through the body's experience of space. The technique works because our psychology is spatial. We think differently in large spaces versus small ones, in bright rooms versus dim ones, in places that echo versus those that absorb sound. Skilled architects use these responses to guide emotions and thoughts in specific directions, making people feel what the builder wants them to feel. Stalin's office in the Kremlin employed this strategy ruthlessly. Visitors had to walk the length of an enormous room while he sat at the far end, watching their approach. By the time they reached his desk, they had been psychologically reduced by the journey, their confidence eroded by the theatrical display of his power. But empty steps serve another function. They create anticipation, building tension through delay. Each footfall becomes a heartbeat in a larger rhythm, preparing the mind for whatever revelation awaits at the destination. The journey becomes as important as the arrival. Modern corporate headquarters still use these principles. The executive floor with its intimidating elevator ride, the expansive reception area, the long corridor to the corner office. Each element designed to remind visitors of their place in the hierarchy before any words are spoken. Yet perhaps the most profound effect is how these spaces change the person experiencing them. After walking the 137 steps, you are not quite the same person who began the journey. The architecture has rewritten your internal sense of scale, of importance, of what is possible in this place where power lives. The power of being late. Napoleon arrived at the crucial battle 3 hours after the appointed time. His generals paced nervously while the enemy formed their lines, wondering if their emperor had abandoned them. Then the familiar silhouette appeared on the horizon, and suddenly those 3 hours of anxiety transformed into explosive relief and loyalty. This was not poor timekeeping. This was psychological warfare. Napoleon understood that arrival creates more impact than presence. The waiting builds tension, creates uncertainty, makes the eventual appearance feel like salvation. The late arrival becomes not just an entrance, but a rescue. The technique requires perfect calibration. Too early, and you seem eager, desperate for approval. Too prompt, and you appear ordinary, another cog in the machine. Too late, and anxiety turns to anger. But arrive at precisely the moment when hope begins to fade, and your presence carries the weight of answered prayers. Ancient Chinese emperors would sometimes keep foreign ambassadors waiting for weeks before granting audience. The delay wasn't mere arrogance, it was a demonstration that the emperor's time moved on a different scale than mortal concerns. When the meeting finally occurred, the ambassador felt grateful just to be acknowledged. The late arrival also serves as a test of loyalty and commitment. Who will wait? Who will leave? Those who remain have proven their dedication through endurance. They have invested time and anxiety in the outcome, making them more psychologically committed to whatever follows. In negotiations, strategic lateness can shift the entire power dynamic. The person who arrives late controls the rhythm of the meeting. They have forced others to adjust their schedules to accommodate their timeline. Before any words are spoken, the hierarchy has been established through the simple act of delayed presence. But perhaps the most sophisticated use involves creating anticipation for ordinary moments. When someone is habitually late, their eventual arrival carries extra weight. People hang on their words more carefully, pay more attention to their actions, because the weight has made everything they do seem more significant. The power works because time is the only thing we truly cannot recover. When someone makes you wait, they are spending your irreplaceable resource. The transaction creates an imbalance that the late person can then exploit, having demonstrated that their time is more valuable than yours through the simple act of keeping you waiting. Modern celebrities still use this ancient technique, arriving fashionably late to events where their delayed entrance becomes the evening's most memorable moment. Questions without answers. Socrates never gave lectures. Instead, he asked questions. Simple ones at first. What is justice? What is courage? What is love? His students would offer confident answers, certain they understood these concepts they used every day. Then came the follow-up questions, each one revealing hidden contradictions in their thinking. This was not teaching. This was demolition. Question by question, Socrates would dismantle his students' certainties, showing them that what they thought they knew was built on shaky foundations. But he never provided replacement answers. He left them suspended in uncertainty, forced to rebuild their understanding from the ground up. The technique works because questions bypass our psychological defenses. When someone makes a statement, we can argue with it, reject it, defend against it. But a genuine question invites participation. It makes us collaborators in our own persuasion, leading us to conclusions that feel like personal discoveries rather than imposed ideas. Jesus used the same approach with his disciples. When they asked direct questions about spiritual matters, he often responded with parables that raised deeper questions rather than providing clear answers. The stories worked on multiple levels, allowing listeners to discover different meanings based on their readiness to understand. The power of unanswered questions lies in how they activate the mind. Our brains cannot tolerate intellectual gaps. When confronted with an unresolved puzzle, we continue working on it unconsciously, turning it over in quiet moments, approaching it from different angles until insight suddenly emerges. But the technique serves a deeper purpose too. By avoiding direct answers, the questioner forces others to think for themselves. The conclusions they reach through their own mental work feel more true, more personal, more convincing than any argument they could have been told. Skilled negotiators understand this principle. Instead of making demands, they ask questions that lead the other party to recognize problems they hadn't seen before. What would happen if we continued with the current arrangement? How would you handle this situation if you were in my position? The questions guide thinking without triggering resistance. Perhaps the most profound aspect is how questions can change the questioner too. When Socrates asked about justice, he wasn't pretending to have the answers. He was genuinely exploring, using his students' responses to deepen his own understanding. The influence flowed in both directions, creating a collaborative search for truth that transformed everyone involved. In this way, the question becomes more powerful than any answer could ever be. The hunger they created. The harvest was abundant that year. Granaries overflowing with grain, yet somehow bread became scarce in the markets of Paris. Merchants whispered about supply problems, transportation delays, storage difficulties. Prices climbed steadily, while warehouses sat full just outside the city walls. This was not natural shortage. This was manufactured scarcity. Wealthy speculators had purchased grain in bulk, holding it back from market to drive prices higher. They created hunger, not through lack of food, but through control of access. The plenty existed, but remained tantalizingly out of reach. The technique works through a fundamental principle of human psychology. We value most what we fear losing. Abundance breeds complacency, but scarcity creates desperate desire. By controlling supply, the grain merchants weren't just selling food, they were selling relief from artificially created anxiety. But the strategy served deeper purposes. Hungry people become focused on immediate survival rather than long-term political action. A population worried about today's bread has little energy for challenging tomorrow's government. Scarcity breeds compliance, making people grateful for small mercies rather than demanding greater justice. De Beers perfected this approach with diamonds in the 20th century. Despite vast supplies of the stones, careful control of market release created the impression of rarity. The artificial scarcity drove prices far beyond what natural supply and demand would have supported, while marketing campaigns convinced people that diamonds were essential symbols of love and status. The psychological impact extends beyond simple desire. Scarcity creates a sense of competition, making people feel they must act quickly before opportunity disappears. The fear of missing out becomes more powerful than the actual value of what is being offered. People make impulsive decisions they might otherwise reconsider. Modern technology companies use similar tactics with limited releases and exclusive access. The scarcity feels real to consumers, even when artificial. The psychological response remains the same, whether shortage is natural or manufactured. Our brains evolved to respond to scarcity as an immediate threat, requiring urgent action. But perhaps the most insidious aspect is how artificial scarcity changes our relationship with abundance. When we become accustomed to shortage, ordinary plenty feels like luxury. The manipulators reset our expectations, making us grateful for what should be normal and ecstatic about what should be merely adequate. The grain merchants understood this perfectly. They weren't just controlling food, they were controlling the emotional state of an entire population, using hunger as a tool to reshape both behavior and perspective. Clothes that speak. The ambassador's robe was woven with threads of gold, each pattern telling a story of his nation's wealth and power. But beneath the magnificent surface lay a more subtle message. The cut of the sleeves followed ancient tradition. The colors matched historical precedent, every detail carefully chosen to communicate respect for diplomatic protocol. This was not vanity. This was vocabulary. In the wordless language of clothing, the ambassador was speaking volumes about his intentions, his nation's status, his understanding of proper relationships between kingdoms. The robe was a diplomatic document worn on his body. Clothing has always carried information beyond its practical function. A Roman toga's width indicated social rank. A medieval lady's headdress revealed her marital status. A samurai's sword placement showed his readiness for battle. These weren't fashion choices. They were social communication systems as precise as written language. The power of dress lies in its immediacy. Before you speak a word, your clothes have already told observers about your wealth, your status, your profession, your cultural background, even your personality. The message is received and processed unconsciously, shaping how others respond to you before conscious interaction begins. Modern psychology confirms what ancient leaders intuited. Studies show that people dressed in formal attire are perceived as more competent, trustworthy, and authoritative than those in casual clothing. The effect works on the wearer too. People think and behave differently when dressed in clothes associated with power and respect. But clothing serves as more than individual communication. It creates group identity, distinguishing insiders from outsiders, allies from enemies, leaders from followers. Uniforms don't just identify roles. They psychologically transform the people wearing them, making them feel and act more like the idealized version of their position. The most sophisticated clothing influence operates through subtle signals rather than obvious displays. A perfectly tailored suit speaks of attention to detail and financial resources. Quality fabric suggests discernment and success. Small accessories can indicate membership in exclusive groups or knowledge of specialized contexts. Perhaps the most powerful aspect is how clothes can give people permission to act differently. Put on a doctor's coat, and people begin treating you with medical authority. Wear a uniform, and others expect you to take charge in emergencies. The costume becomes a kind of social contract, granting both privileges and responsibilities based on its symbolic meaning. In this way, the ambassador's golden robe was not just beautiful clothing, it was a portable embassy, carrying his nation's voice in every thread. The theater of common folk. The queen stepped down from her carriage and walked directly into the muddy village street. No red carpet, no formal ceremony, just a royal presence among common people doing their daily work. She spoke with farmers about their crops, listened to complaints about local officials, even helped an elderly woman carry water from the well. This was not spontaneous compassion. This was carefully orchestrated theater. Every gesture had been planned, every conversation anticipated, every moment designed to create specific impressions in the minds of both participants and observers. The queen was performing the role of a leader who cared about ordinary people. The technique works because authenticity is almost impossible to distinguish from skilled performance. When someone powerful appears to set aside their privileges to engage with regular people, it creates a powerful emotional response. The apparent sacrifice of status generates gratitude and loyalty more effectively than any formal decree. But the performance serves multiple purposes. It demonstrates that the ruler is accessible, connected to common concerns, willing to leave the comfortable palace to understand real problems. These qualities make the leader seem more human, more trustworthy, more deserving of support than distant authority figures who remain isolated in their privilege. The theater also creates witnesses. The people who interact directly with the leader become advocates for their character, telling others about the experience, spreading stories of the ruler's genuine concern for ordinary citizens. These personal testimonies carry more weight than any official propaganda could achieve. Ancient Roman politicians perfected this approach during election campaigns. Candidates would deliberately dress in simple white togas, walk through markets shaking hands with merchants, attend public festivals and religious ceremonies. They called it ambitus, the practice of seeking popular favor through visible engagement with common citizens. The key is making the performance feel spontaneous and genuine. If the staging becomes obvious, the effect reverses. People feel manipulated rather than valued, used as props rather than respected as individuals. The art lies in creating encounters that feel natural while serving calculated political purposes. Modern politicians still use these ancient techniques, appearing at diners and factories, engaging in supposedly unscripted conversations with voters. The encounters are heavily managed, but the psychological impact remains powerful when executed skillfully. Perhaps the most sophisticated aspect is how the theater changes both performer and audience. The ruler who regularly engages with common concerns may actually begin to understand and care about them more deeply, while citizens who interact with power develop more personal investment in the political system. Wine before the verdict. The judge invited both lawyers to his private chambers for refreshments before announcing his decision. Fine wine, excellent cheese, pleasant conversation about everything except the case they had just argued. The atmosphere was civilized, convivial, almost friendly. Then came the verdict that would change lives forever. This was not hospitality. This was psychological preparation. The wine and pleasant conversation were creating a sense of social obligation, making it more difficult for the lawyers to later challenge or criticize whatever decision followed. The judge was binding them to the outcome through the ancient power of shared hospitality. The technique exploits a deep human instinct. When someone offers food and drink, accepts our presence in their private space, engages us in friendly conversation, they create reciprocal obligation. We feel indebted to be gracious guests, even when the host's ultimate actions may work against our interests. Ancient Greek culture codified this principle in the concept of xenia, sacred hospitality that created bonds between strangers. Once you had shared someone's table, you were bound by mutual obligation. Even enemies could find temporary peace through the ritual of shared food and drink. But the strategy serves practical purposes too. The social interaction humanizes all parties, making it harder to maintain adversarial positions. When you've shared wine with someone, laughed at their jokes, discussed personal interests, it becomes psychologically difficult to view them as purely hostile to your cause. The timing is crucial. The hospitality must come after positions are established, but before final decisions are made. If offered too early, it might appear to be attempted bribery. If offered too late, it serves no influential purpose. The perfect moment is when minds can still be subtly shaped by the social experience. Medieval diplomats understood this principle, conducting serious negotiations over elaborate feasts that could last for days. Treaties were often sealed, not just with signatures, but with ceremonial toasts and shared meals that created psychological bonds between former adversaries. Modern business negotiations frequently employ similar tactics. The deal is discussed over dinner, contracts signed in exclusive restaurants, partnerships celebrated with expensive wine. The social context creates emotional investment in successful outcomes. Perhaps the most insidious aspect is how the hospitality makes resistance feel ungrateful. Once you have accepted someone's generosity, opposing their wishes feels like a betrayal of their kindness, even when their kindness was strategically deployed to achieve that exact psychological result. The wine creates obligation, more binding than any legal contract, because it engages emotions rather than mere reason. Letters never sent. The drawer held 17 letters, each one carefully written, sealed, and addressed, but never delivered. They contained apologies, explanations, confessions, desperate pleas for understanding. The emperor's secretary had written them all, pouring genuine emotion into correspondence that was never meant to reach its recipients. This was the practice of therapeutic deception. The act of writing the letters provided psychological release for the secretary, allowing him to express feelings that would have been politically dangerous to actually communicate. But the emperor knew about these letters, read them secretly, and used the emotional information to better understand and manipulate his subordinate. The technique reveals something profound about human psychology. We often write our truest thoughts in letters we never intend to send. The process of putting feelings into words provides relief even without the catharsis of actual communication. The unsent letter becomes a safe space for honesty that would be too dangerous or painful to actually share. But the emperor's knowledge of these private writings gave him unprecedented insight into his secretary's mind. He could see past the careful politeness of daily interaction to the raw emotions underneath. Fear, ambition, resentment, loyalty, all laid bare in correspondence that was supposed to remain private. This created a profound power imbalance. The secretary believed his deepest thoughts were his own, while the emperor possessed intimate knowledge of his subordinate's psychological state. Decisions could be made, rewards offered, punishments avoided, all based on information the secretary had unknowingly provided through his therapeutic writing. The practice spread throughout the court as others adopted the habit of writing unsent letters to process their emotions. What they didn't realize was that these private documents were being systematically collected and analyzed, creating detailed psychological profiles of everyone in the emperor's inner circle. Modern intelligence services have discovered similar techniques. Personal journals, private emails, confidential therapy notes all provide windows into human psychology that can be exploited by those with access. The private space, where people believe they can be honest, becomes the very source of their vulnerability. The unsent letters also served another purpose. They allowed people to rehearse conversations they might never have, to practice arguments they would never make, to explore possibilities they would never pursue. In this way, the letters became laboratories for emotions that shaped real-world behavior even when the correspondence itself remained hidden. Perhaps the most tragic aspect was how this violated the fundamental human need for private thought. The secretary's inner world, expressed in letters he believed would remain secret, became raw material for his own manipulation. His honesty was weaponized against him without his knowledge or consent. The architecture of fear. The castle's entrance was designed to terrify. Visitors had to cross a narrow bridge over a deep moat, pass through multiple gates that could trap them between thick walls, then climb a winding staircase where defenders could attack from above. Every step of the approach was calculated to break the spirit before any negotiation began. This was architecture as psychological warfare. The building itself was an argument for submission, each architectural feature making the case that resistance was futile. The message was clear before any words were spoken. This place cannot be conquered. Its inhabitants cannot be defeated. Your best option is cooperation. Medieval architects understood that fear could be built into stone and mortar. The impossibly high walls, the narrow windows like watching eyes, the massive gates that could crush intruders, all combined to create an emotional experience that weakened opposition before it could form. But the architecture worked on defenders too. Living within such impressive fortifications increased confidence, made residents feel invulnerable, created a sense that they possessed power that could not be challenged. The building shaped the psychology of everyone who inhabited it, turning ordinary people into those who felt destined to rule. The technique extends beyond military architecture. Churches soared impossibly high to make worshippers feel small in the face of divine power. Palace throne rooms were designed to overwhelm visitors with displays of wealth and authority. Even simple buildings could be arranged to create specific psychological effects in those who entered. Modern corporate architecture still employs these principles. The intimidating headquarters, the executive floor with its commanding views, the reception area designed to make visitors feel their relative unimportance. Glass and steel have replaced stone, but the psychological purposes remain unchanged. The power of architectural fear lies in how it bypasses rational thought. You cannot argue with a building. Its influence works directly on emotions, on instinctive responses to height, space, light, and shadow. The message penetrates deeper than words because it speaks to more primitive parts of the mind. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect is how fear architecture creates self-fulfilling prophecies. When people believe a place is impregnable, they are less likely to attempt conquest. When they feel diminished by their surroundings, they behave in ways that confirm their relative powerlessness. The castle's stones were more than defensive barriers. They were psychological weapons that won battles before they were fought, creating victory through the simple fact of existing in a form too overwhelming to challenge. Gifts without strings. The merchant presented the valuable silk with no mention of payment, no request for favors, no hint of expectation. He simply offered it as a token of respect, bowed deeply, and withdrew. The recipient examined the beautiful fabric, confused by the apparent generosity. What was the catch? What did the merchant really want? This was the power of the mysterious gift. By offering something valuable without obvious strings attached, the merchant created a psychological puzzle that would occupy the recipient's mind for weeks. The uncertainty generated more influence than any direct request could have achieved. The technique works because humans are reciprocity-driven creatures. When someone gives us something, we automatically feel obligated to give something back. But when the gift comes without clear expectations, we create our own obligations, often more generous than what the giver might have originally requested. Ancient Chinese diplomacy perfected this approach. Elaborate gifts were exchanged between kingdoms with no formal treaties attached. The receiving nation would spend months analyzing the presents, trying to decode their hidden meanings, eventually offering their own valuable gifts in response to obligations they had largely imagined. But the mystery gift serves deeper psychological purposes. It creates a sense of indebtedness that cannot be easily resolved. When someone asks for a specific favor, you can grant it and feel the obligation has been fulfilled. When the request remains unclear, the debt feels perpetual, impossible to fully repay. The timing of revelation becomes crucial. The merchant who gives silk today might return months later with a request that seems small compared to the valuable gift already received. The original generosity reframes any later ask as reasonable, even modest, regardless of its actual significance. Modern businesses use similar strategies. Free samples, unexpected upgrades, small gifts to valued customers all create psychological obligations that influence future purchasing decisions. The company appears generous while actually investing in future loyalty and sales. The most sophisticated practitioners make the gift seem spontaneous, emotional, even impulsive, rather than calculated. The recipient believes they have inspired genuine affection or respect, making the resulting obligation feel like a privilege rather than a burden. Perhaps the most powerful aspect is how gifts without strings make people complicit in their own influence. The recipient cannot complain about manipulation because nothing was explicitly demanded. They participated willingly in creating their own sense of obligation, making resistance feel ungrateful and unreasonable. The silk was never really free. Its price was simply deferred until the recipient's gratitude could be harvested at the most advantageous moment. The rhythm of repetition. The phrase appeared in every speech, every proclamation, every public statement. For the glory of Rome, not shouted dramatically, not emphasized with special ceremony, just woven naturally into the fabric of official communication. Citizens heard it so often, they stopped noticing it consciously, yet the words embedded themselves deeper with each repetition. This was the technique of saturated repetition. By making certain ideas ubiquitous, leaders could program them into the background of public consciousness. The phrase became as natural as breathing, as automatic as thinking, until it shaped perception without triggering awareness. The power lies in how repetition bypasses critical thinking. When we hear something once, we evaluate it. When we hear it repeatedly, we begin to accept it as background truth. The familiar feels trustworthy simply because it is familiar. Repetition creates the illusion of consensus, making ideas seem widely accepted even when they haven't been consciously examined. Ancient Greek educators understood this principle. Students would recite poetry and philosophical passages until the words became part of their mental architecture. The repeated phrases shaped their thoughts, values, and way of seeing the world. Learning was not just about understanding ideas, but about internalizing them through rhythmic repetition. Modern advertising employs the same technique with jingles, slogans, and brand messages that repeat until they become part of our mental soundtrack. Just do it, or I'm loving it, work their way into consciousness through sheer repetition, influencing behavior below the threshold of awareness. But repetition serves more than commercial purposes. Political movements use chanted slogans to create unity and shared identity. Religious traditions employ repeated prayers and phrases to deepen spiritual connection. Even personal affirmations work through the same principle, reshaping self-perception through consistent repetition. The rhythm matters as much as the content. Phrases that match natural speech patterns or breathing rhythms embed more deeply than awkward constructions. The best repeated messages feel like they were always part of language, obvious truths that everyone already knew. The technique becomes dangerous when repetition replaces reasoning. Ideas that are repeated without examination can become unquestionable truths, even when they lack evidence or logic. The familiarity breeds acceptance that can override critical thinking entirely. Perhaps the most insidious aspect is how saturated repetition makes people feel like they chose their beliefs. The repeated ideas feel natural, personal, obvious. People defend them passionately without remembering that their certainty came not from personal reflection, but from endless exposure to the same message. For the glory of Rome became more than a slogan. It became the rhythm by which an empire thought about itself. Doors left half open. The council meeting had ended, but one door remained slightly ajar. Through the narrow gap, fragments of conversation drifted into the hallway where servants went about their duties. Not enough to understand the full discussion, just tantalizing hints about decisions that would affect everyone in the palace. This was the technique of strategic revelation. By allowing partial information to escape, the council created more intrigue than complete secrecy could have achieved. The servants strained to hear more, filling the gaps with speculation, creating stories more dramatic than the mundane reality of administrative discussions. The half-open door works because incomplete information is more compelling than either full disclosure or total secrecy. When we can see part of something, our minds become obsessed with completing the picture. The mystery generates more attention than transparency, while seeming less manipulative than obvious concealment. Ancient Roman politicians mastered this approach with their private dining clubs. Members would deliberately speak just loudly enough for outsiders to catch fragments of conversation about political plans and insider information. The partial revelations created the impression of being almost admitted to elite circles, generating loyalty from those who felt they were receiving exclusive access. But the technique serves deeper purposes than mere intrigue. The overheard information feels more trustworthy because it wasn't intended for our ears. We assume that private conversations reveal truth more clearly than public statements. What we discover accidentally seems more authentic than what we are told directly. The partial revelation also creates a sense of participation. Those who overhear fragments feel like insiders, even though they remain completely outside the actual decision-making process. They become invested in outcomes they helped imagine, loyal to leaders whose real plans they have never understood. Modern marketing employs similar strategies with leaked information about upcoming products, exclusive previews that are actually carefully planned reveals, and insider information that is strategically shared to build anticipation and demand. The most sophisticated practitioners make the revelation seem genuinely accidental. The door that is supposedly forgotten open, the conversation that is allegedly overheard by chance, the document that is accidentally left visible. The appearance of spontaneity makes the information feel more valuable and trustworthy. Perhaps the most powerful aspect is how the technique makes people complicit in their own manipulation. They feel clever for discovering information that was actually provided to them, proud of insights that were deliberately planted. Their sense of discovery creates ownership of ideas that were never really their own. The half-open door reveals just enough to create the illusion of seeing behind the curtain while keeping the real machinery of power completely hidden. The currency of secrets. She leaned closer across the cafe table, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Promise me you won't tell anyone else." The words that followed were interesting but not particularly shocking, yet somehow the request for secrecy made them feel precious, important, worth protecting. The secret had acquired value simply by being labeled as one. This is the alchemy of confidential information. By marking knowledge as secret, we transform ordinary facts into psychological currency. People hoard secrets, trade them, use them to build relationships and establish status. The content matters less than the exclusive nature of possessing information that others cannot have. The technique works because secrets make us feel special, chosen, trusted with something valuable. Even mundane information becomes significant when shared in confidence. The person telling the secret positions themselves as someone with access to hidden knowledge, while the person receiving it feels elevated into an inner circle of trusted confidants. Medieval courts ran on secret currencies. Nobles traded whispered information about romantic entanglements, political alliances, financial troubles, personal weaknesses. The secrets themselves were often trivial, but possessing them created networks of obligation and influence that determined who held real power in the kingdom. But secrets serve functions beyond social climbing. They create bonds between people who share them, intimate connections forged through mutual vulnerability. When someone tells you their secret, they are placing themselves in your hands, creating a relationship that transcends ordinary social interaction. The most effective secrets contain just enough truth to feel authentic while serving the secret teller's larger purposes. A politician might reveal a minor personal failing to create the impression of honesty while concealing more significant problems. The small confession creates credibility that protects against larger suspicions. Modern intelligence services understand how secrets create influence. Agents don't just gather information, they strategically share selected secrets to build trust with sources, create obligations, and establish their own credibility as people with access to valuable knowledge. The psychology becomes complex when secrets are used to manipulate the secret keeper. By sharing confidential information, the teller can implicate the listener in their schemes, making them complicit through knowledge alone. The secret becomes a form of insurance, ensuring silence through mutual vulnerability. Perhaps the most insidious aspect is how the currency of secrets corrupts the value of truth itself. When information is prized for its exclusivity rather than its accuracy, people begin to prefer hidden lies over obvious truths. The secret feels more valuable than the fact, regardless of which one is actually useful. The whispered words across the cafe table were never really about sharing information. They were about creating obligation, establishing intimacy, and turning ordinary conversation into a transaction of trust. Weakness as strength. The new king appeared before his court, with his arm in a sling, moving slowly, clearly in pain from recent injuries. His advisors had urged him to postpone public appearances until he had fully healed, but he insisted on showing himself to his people. The visible weakness, unexpectedly, made him seem more human, more trustworthy, more worthy of protection and loyalty. This was the counterintuitive power of strategic vulnerability. By revealing his injuries instead of hiding them, the king created a deeper connection with his subjects than any display of strength could have achieved. People protect what they perceive as vulnerable, and they trust leaders who appear human rather than invincible. The technique works because perfect strength feels threatening while visible weakness invites care. When leaders appear flawless, subjects may admire them but cannot relate to them. When they show their wounds, their struggles, their moments of uncertainty, they become people worth following rather than just powers to be feared. Franklin Roosevelt understood this principle when he allowed photographers to capture him in his wheelchair rather than maintaining the illusion of physical strength. The images of vulnerability generated more public support than any demonstration of political power could have created. His weakness became proof of his courage, his humanity, his determination to serve despite personal challenges. But the strategy requires careful calibration. The weakness must appear noble rather than pathetic, temporary rather than permanent, overcomable rather than defeating. The king's injury suggested recent battle, sacrifice for his kingdom, wounds earned in service to his people. It told a story of strength tested rather than strength absent. The revelation of vulnerability also serves as a test of loyalty. Those who remain supportive when their leader appears weak have proven their commitment goes deeper than mere opportunism. The weakness separates true allies from fair-weather friends, creating a more reliable inner circle. Ancient military leaders sometimes employed this technique by deliberately exposing themselves to the same dangers as their soldiers, sharing the same hardships, eating the same food, sleeping in the same conditions. The shared vulnerability created bonds stronger than any formal hierarchy could establish. Modern politicians still use strategic weakness, sharing personal struggles, admitting past mistakes, showing emotional moments that humanize them to voters. The carefully managed vulnerability creates authenticity that polls better than manufactured perfection. Perhaps the most profound aspect is how weakness can become a source of moral authority. The leader who has suffered, struggled, and persevered carries credibility that the untested cannot match. Their scars become credentials. Their recovery becomes inspiration. The king's sling was not a sign of failure. It was a badge of service, proof that he had risked himself for his kingdom and was willing to continue leading despite the cost. The magic of small favors. The office secretary kept a bowl of mints on her desk, nothing expensive or elaborate, just small candies freely offered to anyone who stopped by. Visitors would take one absent-mindedly, hardly noticing the gesture. Yet somehow people found themselves being more cooperative with her requests, more willing to bend rules, more inclined to share information they might normally withhold. This was the influence of micro-reciprocity. The tiny gift created a sense of obligation completely disproportionate to its actual value. People felt they owed something in return for the mint, and that feeling influenced their behavior in subtle but significant ways. The secretary had discovered that the smallest gifts could generate the largest psychological returns. The technique works because reciprocity operates below our conscious awareness. We automatically feel obligated to return favors, even tiny ones. The mint creates a social debt that most people want to resolve, making them more agreeable and cooperative. The size of the gift doesn't matter. What matters is that it feels like a gift at all. Ancient traders understood this principle when they would offer small tokens to potential customers before beginning negotiations. A cup of tea, a piece of fruit, a small carved ornament. The gifts were insignificant in economic terms, but created psychological conditions that made buyers more willing to make purchases and accept higher prices. But small favors serve purposes beyond creating obligation. They establish the giver as thoughtful, generous, someone who pays attention to others' comfort and needs. The person offering mints becomes associated with pleasant experiences, making people want to spend time around them and be helpful in return. The timing of small favors can multiply their impact, offering help when someone is struggling, providing refreshments when people are tired, sharing useful information when it's needed most. The favor that arrives at the perfect moment creates gratitude that far exceeds its actual value. Restaurant servers employ this technique when they bring extra bread, refill water glasses without being asked, or offer after-dinner mints with a check. These small services cost almost nothing but significantly increase tip amounts because they make customers feel cared for and appreciated. The most effective small favors appear spontaneous rather than calculated. The gift that seems to come from genuine impulse rather than strategic thinking feels more authentic and generates stronger reciprocal feelings. The art lies in making calculated kindness appear completely natural. Perhaps the most powerful aspect is how small favors can initiate escalating cycles of reciprocity. The mint leads to cooperation, which the secretary acknowledges with gratitude, which leads to more cooperation. Small gifts can grow into significant relationships when managed skillfully over time. The bowl of mints was never about the candy. It was about creating a culture of mutual assistance, one tiny favor at a time. Time's invisible hand. The meeting was scheduled to begin at 3 o'clock, but somehow it was 4:30 before any real decisions were made. The participants had arrived punctually, engaged in preliminary discussions, covered all the agenda items, yet the crucial moment of commitment had been subtly delayed until everyone was tired, hungry, and eager to reach conclusion. This was the manipulation of decision fatigue. As mental energy depletes throughout the day, people become more willing to accept proposals they might have scrutinized more carefully when fresh. The timing of important requests can determine their success more than their actual merit. Time becomes a tool for wearing down resistance without appearing to apply pressure. The technique works because our cognitive resources are limited and renewable. Early in the day, we can analyze complex problems, consider multiple options, ask probing questions. As fatigue accumulates, we begin seeking shortcuts, accepting familiar solutions, avoiding the mental work required for thorough evaluation. Ancient Roman senators understood this principle when they would save their most controversial proposals for the end of long legislative sessions. By the time these items came up for vote, their colleagues were exhausted from hours of debate and eager to conclude proceedings. Measures that might have faced fierce opposition when fresh passed with minimal discussion when senators simply wanted to go home. But temporal manipulation extends beyond mere fatigue. Different times of day affect mood, risk tolerance, and decision-making style. People tend to be more optimistic in the morning, more cautious in the afternoon, more willing to take risks when slightly hungry. Skilled negotiators match their requests to these natural rhythms. The technique also exploits our relationship with deadlines. As time pressure increases, we become more willing to accept imperfect solutions rather than continue searching for better options. The person controlling the timeline can create artificial urgency that forces quick decisions favoring their interests. Modern retailers use temporal influence with limited time offers, flash sales, and countdown timers that create pressure to buy now rather than deliberate further. The technique works even when customers know the urgency is artificial, because the psychological pressure feels real regardless of its source. Perhaps the most sophisticated aspect is how time manipulation can be made to appear natural rather than deliberate. The meeting that runs long due to thorough discussion, the deadline that emerges from unavoidable circumstances, the delay that results from careful consideration. The temporal pressure feels organic, even when it has been carefully orchestrated. The 4:30 decision was not delayed by accident. It was the product of invisible scheduling, designed to arrive at the moment when acceptance would feel like relief rather than commitment. The burden of choice. The restaurant menu contained 47 different pasta dishes, each described in elaborate detail with multiple options for sauces, preparations, and accompaniments. Diners would spend long minutes studying the overwhelming array of possibilities, often growing frustrated and anxious rather than excited about their meal. Many ended up choosing nothing, leaving without ordering. This was the paradox of excessive choice. While options seem desirable, too many alternatives can create paralysis rather than satisfaction. The abundance that should have felt empowering instead became overwhelming, turning a simple decision into an exhausting mental exercise that many people preferred to avoid entirely. The technique works because our brains evolved to handle limited options efficiently. When faced with vast arrays of choices, we become cognitively overloaded, unable to process all the information needed for optimal decisions. The result is either paralysis or regret, as we worry we might have chosen better from the many alternatives we didn't fully consider. Ancient Greek philosophers warned about this phenomenon. Aristotle noted that unlimited freedom could become a form of slavery, as people became trapped by the endless need to choose between possibilities they couldn't adequately evaluate. Too much liberty created its own form of bondage. But choice overload serves purposes beyond mere confusion. It can be used strategically to guide people toward preferred options. By overwhelming customers with complex alternatives, sellers can make simpler choices appear more attractive. The basic package feels reasonable compared to dozens of elaborate variations. Marketing professionals employ this technique by presenting a few good options alongside many poor ones, making the preferred choice stand out through contrast. The decoy effect uses inferior alternatives to make target products seem like obvious best choices. The timing of choice presentation matters too. When people are fresh and alert, they can handle more complexity. When tired or stressed, they gravitate toward familiar, simple options. The burden of choice can be adjusted based on the decision-maker's mental state. Perhaps the most insidious aspect is how excessive choice can undermine satisfaction even when good decisions are made. People who choose from large arrays often feel less happy with their selections than those who choose from smaller ones because they remain haunted by all the alternatives they didn't explore. Modern life amplifies this problem with consumer choices, career paths, relationship options, lifestyle alternatives. The abundance that should represent freedom often creates anxiety, regret, and the persistent feeling that better choices remain unmade. The 47 pasta dishes were not meant to delight customers. They were designed to exhaust their decision-making capacity, making any choice feel like escape from an overwhelming burden rather than satisfying selection of a desired meal. Echoes in empty rooms. The palace throne room was vast, its ceiling soaring impossibly high, every surface polished marble that reflected sound in strange ways. When the king spoke, his words would bounce off the walls, return with subtle alterations, create the impression that multiple voices were speaking in harmony. Visitors found themselves unconsciously lowering their own voices, feeling small in a space designed to amplify royal authority. This was acoustic manipulation, the use of sound and space to influence psychology. The echoing chamber didn't just make the king's voice louder. It made it seem more profound, more important, worthy of the reverence that the architecture itself demanded. Sound became another tool of power, shaping emotions through the physical experience of hearing. The technique works because sound affects us at primitive levels below conscious thought. Deep voices seem more authoritative. Echoes suggest vast spaces and unlimited power. Silence creates tension that demands to be filled. Skilled leaders understand these responses and design their environments to trigger specific psychological reactions. Ancient Greek theaters were carefully engineered to carry actors' voices to the furthest seats while maintaining clarity and emotional impact. The architecture wasn't just practical. It was psychological, creating shared experiences that unified audiences and amplified the emotional power of performed stories. But acoustic influence extends beyond mere volume and clarity. The rhythm of speech, the timing of pauses, the pitch and tone variations all carry meaning that bypasses rational analysis. A leader who speaks with confident rhythms and controlled pacing sounds more competent than one whose delivery suggests uncertainty or nervousness. Modern politicians still employ these techniques with microphones, sound systems, and venue selection designed to optimize their acoustic presence. The right combination of technology and space can make any voice sound presidential, authoritative, worthy of attention and respect. Religious traditions have long understood acoustic power. Chanting creates meditative states through repetitive sounds. Church bells mark time and call communities together. Organs produce sounds that seem to come from beyond human capability. The acoustic environment shapes spiritual experience as much as any spoken message. Perhaps the most subtle aspect is how acoustic design can create intimacy or distance according to need. The whispered confidence that draws listeners closer, the booming proclamation that reaches the furthest corners, the carefully modulated tone that suggests both authority and approachability. The throne room's echoes were not accidents of architecture. They were calculated effects designed to transform ordinary human speech into something that sounded like the voice of power itself, backed by invisible choirs that existed only in the physics of reflected sound. The price of being heard. The counselor charged enormous fees for his advice, not because his insights were necessarily superior to those of cheaper alternatives, but because the high price itself convinced clients that they were receiving wisdom worth paying for. People trusted expensive counsel more than free guidance, even when the content was virtually identical. This was the psychology of price, as quality signal. The cost became part of the message, communicating value through the simple act of being expensive. Clients didn't just buy advice. They bought the confidence that comes from knowing they had invested significantly in their decision-making process. The technique works because we unconsciously associate price with value, assuming that expensive things must be better than cheap alternatives. This isn't entirely irrational. In many contexts, higher prices do correlate with superior quality, but the relationship can be exploited by those who understand how pricing affects perception independently of actual value. Ancient physicians understood this principle when they would charge wealthy patients enormous fees while providing similar treatments to poor clients for minimal cost. The expensive treatments often worked better, not because the medicine was different, but because patients who paid more believed more strongly in the cure's effectiveness. But price influence extends beyond simple quality assumptions. Expensive purchases create psychological investment. When someone pays significantly for advice, they become motivated to believe in its wisdom to justify their expenditure. The high price creates commitment that makes the guidance more likely to be followed and more likely to succeed. The technique also serves as social signaling. Expensive counsel suggests that the buyer is sophisticated enough to recognize quality and wealthy enough to afford the best. The purchase becomes a statement about the client's status and judgment, making them more psychologically invested in the advisor's reputation. Modern consulting firms employ this principle by charging premium rates that position them as elite service providers. The high fees attract clients who want the best, while the price point itself reinforces the impression that they are receiving superior expertise. The timing of payment can influence effectiveness too. Fees paid in advance create stronger psychological commitment than those paid afterward. The upfront investment makes clients more motivated to extract value from the relationship, increasing satisfaction with whatever advice they receive. Perhaps the most sophisticated aspect is how expensive advice can become self-fulfilling prophecy. When people pay significantly for guidance, they approach it with greater seriousness, implement recommendations more carefully, and persist through difficulties more consistently. The price doesn't just buy advice, it buys commitment to making that advice work. The counselor's enormous fees were not obstacles to success. They were essential components of the service, creating psychological conditions that made ordinary insights feel like profound wisdom worth whatever they cost. Masks worn in daylight. The diplomat arrived at court wearing the traditional robes of his homeland, speaking his nation's language through a translator, observing all the customs that marked him as a foreigner. Yet beneath this performance of otherness, he was born in the host country, educated in their universities, fluent in their language. The foreign identity was a carefully constructed mask that served his mission better than authenticity ever could. This was the power of strategic identity performance. By embodying expected stereotypes, the diplomat could access conversations and information that would have been denied to someone perceived as an insider. His artificial foreignness became a key that opened doors his actual background would have kept closed. The technique works because people reveal different aspects of themselves to different audiences. What they say to strangers differs from what they tell friends. What they share with outsiders contrasts with what they discuss among their own kind. By controlling how others perceive your identity, you can influence what they choose to reveal. Ancient Greek spies would adopt the clothing, dialects, and mannerisms of enemy cities to gather intelligence that would have been impossible to obtain as obvious foreigners. The performance of belonging allowed them to blend into communities where their true identities would have made them immediate suspects. But identity masking serves purposes beyond mere deception. It allows people to explore aspects of themselves that their usual social roles might constrain. The quiet person can become bold when wearing an authoritative costume. The serious individual can display humor when adopting a playful persona. The mask also creates psychological distance from consequences. Actions taken while performing a different identity feel less personal, less permanent, less defining of the true self. This can free people to take risks, express opinions, or explore possibilities they might avoid when feeling fully responsible for the outcomes. Modern business negotiations sometimes involve similar identity performances. The executive who dresses down to appear more relatable, the startup founder who adopts corporate styling to seem more established, the expert who emphasizes their outsider status to appear more objective. Social media has amplified identity performance possibilities, allowing people to curate versions of themselves for different audiences, emphasizing selected aspects while downplaying others. The online persona becomes a kind of mask that can be adjusted for different contexts and purposes. Perhaps the most profound aspect is how performed identities can gradually become authentic ones. The diplomat who spends years embodying his foreign persona may find that the mask has shaped the face beneath it, changing not just how others see him but how he sees himself. The traditional robes were not costumes. They were tools that transformed both the wearer and the audience, creating new possibilities for interaction that existed only in the space between authentic and performed identity. The geography of trust. The border checkpoint appeared insignificant, just a simple booth where guards inspected travel documents. But the building's placement created a subtle psychological effect on everyone who passed through it. Positioned exactly halfway between two hills, it forced travelers to approach downhill from either direction, literally looking down at the checkpoint from elevated ground before descending to the inspection point. This was architectural psychology in service of authority. The guards worked from a position that travelers had to approach from above, creating a sense that people were coming down to meet power rather than being elevated toward it. The geography itself taught lessons about hierarchy, submission, and the proper relationship between citizens and state authority. The technique works because spatial relationships unconsciously influence social relationships. We associate height with power, depth with vulnerability, distance with respect, proximity with intimacy. By controlling the physical experience of encounter, architects can shape the psychological experience of interaction. Ancient Chinese palace design employed these principles extensively. Visitors would ascend multiple levels to reach the emperor's audience chamber, each step increasing their sense of approaching ultimate authority. The physical journey upward became a metaphor for spiritual elevation, making the final encounter feel like communion with celestial power. But geographical influence extends beyond mere height differences. The path people must take to reach a destination affects their psychological state upon arrival. A winding approach creates contemplation and gradual preparation. A straight, direct path suggests urgency and efficiency. A difficult journey makes the destination feel more valuable. Medieval cathedral builders understood how geography could enhance spiritual experience. Churches were often positioned on elevated ground, requiring pilgrims to climb toward them. The physical effort of approach became part of the religious experience, making the sacred space feel earned rather than simply accessible. Modern urban planners still use geographical psychology when designing government buildings, corporate headquarters, and cultural institutions. The approach routes, the positioning relative to surrounding structures, the relationship between parking areas and entrances all influence how people feel about the institutions they are visiting. The most subtle aspect is how geographical arrangements can make power relationships seem natural rather than constructed. When authority is literally positioned above subjects, when citizens must climb to reach their representatives, when guards work from elevated positions, the hierarchy feels like a reflection of natural order rather than arbitrary social arrangement. Perhaps the most insidious element is how geography can normalize surveillance and control. The checkpoint positioned to observe all approaches, the office building designed to monitor employee movements, the public square arranged to facilitate crowd control. The physical environment shapes behavior while appearing to be merely functional. The border checkpoint's simple booth was positioned not just for practical convenience, but to create a specific psychological experience for every person who passed through it, teaching lessons about power through the simple act of walking downhill. Words that wound slowly. The critic's review was masterfully written, full of subtle praise and gentle observations. He complimented the artist's brave attempt at innovation, admired their persistent efforts to create something meaningful, and noted how their work demonstrated admirable ambition despite certain limitations. Only hours later did the artist realize how thoroughly they had been destroyed with kindness. This was the art of the poisoned compliment, words that appeared supportive while carrying subtle implications of failure. Each phrase contained a hidden barb that wounded more deeply than direct criticism because it forced the target to decode the insult themselves, making them complicit in their own psychological injury. The technique works because our brains automatically complete implied meanings. When someone praises your brave attempt, the word attempt suggests failure, while brave implies the effort was doomed from the start. The compliment becomes a way of highlighting inadequacy while maintaining the appearance of support. Ancient Roman senators perfected this approach in their political rhetoric. They would praise their opponent's youthful enthusiasm to suggest inexperience, commend their passionate sincerity to imply naivety, or admire their simple honesty to indicate stupidity. The Senate floor became a battleground of backhanded compliments, more devastating than direct attacks. But poison compliments serve purposes beyond mere insult. They create plausible deniability for the speaker, who can always claim they were being genuinely supportive if challenged. The ambiguity protects the critic while maximizing damage to the target, who cannot respond without seeming paranoid or ungrateful. The wounds these words create are particularly deep because they attack the victim's judgment as well as their abilities. Not only did you fail, the compliment suggests, but you failed to recognize your own failure. The double injury combines professional criticism with personal humiliation. Modern workplace dynamics often employ these techniques through performance reviews that damn with faint praise. Shows great enthusiasm for learning, suggests incompetence masked as growth mindset. Brings fresh perspectives implies lack of relevant experience. Very detail-oriented can mean missing the big picture. The timing of poisoned compliments affects their impact. Delivered publicly, they humiliate through shared witness. Offered privately, they create intimate betrayal. Embedded in written reviews, they become permanent records that continue wounding long after the initial delivery. Perhaps the most sophisticated aspect is how these compliments can reshape the target's self-perception over time. Repeated exposure to subtly diminishing praise can erode confidence more effectively than direct criticism because the victim begins to internalize the implied inadequacies while feeling they should be grateful for the recognition. The review appeared generous and thoughtful, the kind of critique any artist would appreciate. Only the slow burn of realization revealed how thoroughly the praise had been weaponized, turning apparent support into a more effective form of destruction than any honest attack could have achieved. The comfort of familiar lies. The newspapers all reported the same story with minor variations, creating the impression of independent confirmation when they were actually copying from a single questionable source. Citizens read multiple accounts and felt confident they understood the truth, not realizing they were seeing one lie reflected through several mirrors. This was the technique of manufactured consensus. By spreading the same misinformation through multiple channels, propagandists could make false narratives feel thoroughly verified. People naturally trust information that appears in several sources, assuming that independent verification has occurred when no such verification actually exists. The technique works because our brains use repetition and source diversity as shortcuts for evaluating truth. When we see the same claim made by different outlets, we assume they have independently confirmed the facts. We don't investigate whether they all relied on the same original source, which might have been biased, mistaken, or deliberately deceptive. Ancient Roman political factions would coordinate their messaging across multiple senators, having different speakers make similar points in various forums. The repetition across seemingly independent voices created the impression of widespread agreement, even when the consensus was artificially manufactured by central coordination. But familiar lies serve deeper psychological needs than mere persuasion. People want to believe information that confirms their existing views, supports their preferred narratives, and validates their emotional responses to complex events. False stories that feel true are more comforting than true stories that feel wrong. The comfort comes from avoiding the cognitive work required to process challenging information. When lies align with our expectations, we can accept them without the mental effort needed to integrate contradictory evidence or revise our understanding of the world. Familiar lies feel easy, while difficult truths feel exhausting. Modern social media amplifies this effect through algorithm-driven echo chambers that show people information similar to what they've engaged with previously. The repetition feels like confirmation when it's actually just algorithmic reinforcement of existing preferences. The most dangerous aspect is how comfortable lies can crowd out uncomfortable truths entirely. When false narratives become widespread enough, they create their own evidence through the shared belief of large groups. The lie becomes socially true, even when it remains factually false. Perhaps the most insidious element is how manufactured consensus makes people feel informed when they are actually misinformed. They have done their due diligence by checking multiple sources, not realizing that all their sources were reflections of the same original deception. The newspaper's consistent reporting felt like thorough journalism, providing readers with confidence that came not from actual verification, but from seeing the same comfortable lie told in multiple familiar voices. Bridges built from nothing. The peace negotiator arrived with no formal authority, no signed documents, no official backing from either government. He simply began talking to both sides as if an agreement were possible, asking practical questions about implementation, discussing technical details of cooperation, treating the hostile parties as if they were already partners working through minor disagreements. This was the technique of assumed resolution. By acting as if peace were inevitable and focusing on practical rather than political obstacles, the negotiator made compromise feel natural and reasonable. He built a bridge between enemies using nothing but the presumption that such a bridge should exist. The technique works because people often rise to meet expectations, especially when those expectations are expressed through confident action rather than hopeful words. When someone treats you as capable, trustworthy, and reasonable, you feel psychological pressure to live up to that treatment, even in situations where such behavior might seem impossible. Ancient Mediterranean merchants used similar approaches when dealing with hostile tribes. Instead of negotiating from positions of mutual suspicion, they would simply begin conducting business as if peaceful trade were already established. The assumption of normal commercial relationships often created the reality of such relationships. But building bridges from assumptions requires extraordinary skill in reading people and situations. The negotiator must accurately assess whether the parties actually want resolution but lack a framework for achieving it, versus situations where fundamental conflicts make compromise genuinely impossible. The assumed resolution technique also changes the emotional dynamic of conflict. Instead of focusing on past grievances and incompatible demands, attention shifts to future possibilities and practical challenges. The conversation moves from why we can't agree to how we will make this work. Modern diplomatic breakthroughs often begin with informal contacts that treat resolution as probable rather than merely possible. Track 2 diplomacy operates through academics, business leaders, and other unofficial intermediaries who can explore cooperation without the formal constraints that limit government negotiations. The power lies in how assumptions can become self-fulfilling prophecies when applied with sufficient confidence and skill. People begin to believe that cooperation is possible because someone else clearly believes it, and that shared belief creates the foundation for actual agreements. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect is how bridges built from nothing can become stronger than those constructed from formal treaties and elaborate agreements. When people choose to cooperate based on assumptions rather than guarantees, they demonstrate commitment that goes beyond legal obligations. The negotiator's confident presumption of peace created space for formerly impossible conversations, turning assumption into reality through the simple act of behaving as if resolution were already within reach. The weight of unspoken debts. The village elder never asked for repayment, never mentioned the loans, never even acknowledged that debts existed. When families struggled with failed harvests or unexpected expenses, he simply provided what was needed with quiet generosity. Yet somehow, everyone remembered exactly what they owed, and the knowledge shaped their behavior in ways more powerful than any formal contract. This was the influence of moral obligation without legal enforcement. By refusing to turn generosity into business transactions, the elder created debts that felt more binding than formal agreements. People wanted to repay not because they feared consequences, but because their sense of integrity demanded it. The technique works because unspoken debts engage our deepest psychological drives toward reciprocity and fairness. When someone helps us without demanding formal acknowledgement, we feel personally responsible for remembering and repaying the favor. The absence of external enforcement makes the obligation feel more authentic, more meaningful. Ancient Japanese culture formalized this principle through concepts like juri, moral obligations that exist independently of legal requirements. These social debts could not be enforced through courts, but carried more weight than formal contracts because they engaged honor, reputation, and community standing. But unspoken debts serve purposes beyond mere obligation. They create ongoing relationships between creditor and debtor that formal transactions cannot match. The person who owes feels connected to their benefactor, invested in their welfare, motivated to maintain the relationship through continued mutual support. The elder's approach also demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human psychology. Direct requests for repayment can create resentment, while unspoken expectations allow people to feel generous when they return favors. The repayment becomes a gift rather than an obligation, preserving dignity on both sides. Modern businesses sometimes employ similar techniques through exceptional customer service that creates loyalty without formal rewards programs. Companies that solve problems without being asked, provide unexpected benefits, or go beyond contracted services often generate devotion that far exceeds their actual investment. The timing of unspoken debt acknowledgement affects its power. The benefactor who never mentions their generosity allows recipients to feel constantly grateful, while those who eventually call in favors can leverage accumulated goodwill for significant returns on their original investment. Perhaps the most sophisticated aspect is how unspoken debts can create networks of mutual obligation that strengthen entire communities. When everyone owes something to someone else, and everyone is owed something in return, the social fabric becomes self-reinforcing through invisible threads of reciprocal commitment. The village elder's quiet generosity created more than individual obligations. It established a system of mutual responsibility that bound the entire community together through the shared understanding that help given would eventually be help returned. Music without instruments. The corporate meeting had no background music, no obvious audio cues, yet somehow it followed a distinct rhythm. The CEO would pause at specific intervals, allowing silence to build tension before delivering key points. Questions were asked in measured cadences that suggested careful thought. Even the scheduling created a musical structure, with breaks positioned like movements in a symphony. This was the power of conversational orchestration. By controlling the rhythm, pacing, and timing of interactions, leaders could guide meetings like conductors guide orchestras. The participants became instruments playing parts they didn't realize had been composed for them. The technique works because human communication naturally follows musical patterns. We use rhythm, pitch, volume, and timing to convey meaning beyond words. Skilled communicators can manipulate these elements to create specific emotional responses and influence the flow of discussion. Ancient Greek orators studied rhythm as carefully as they studied rhetoric. They understood that the timing of words, the pacing of arguments, and the cadence of delivery could affect audiences more powerfully than logical content. The music of speech carried meaning that bypassed rational analysis. But conversational music serves purposes beyond mere persuasion. It can create unity among participants, making them feel like they are part of a harmonious group working toward shared goals. The shared rhythm creates psychological synchronization that builds cooperation and reduces conflict. The CEO's orchestration included subtle techniques like matching his speaking pace to participants' breathing rhythms, using pauses to create anticipation for important announcements, and timing difficult topics for moments when the group's attention was most focused and receptive. Modern negotiations often employ musical principles through careful pacing of concessions, strategic use of silence to create pressure, and rhythm patterns that make agreements feel like natural conclusions to building musical phrases. Religious traditions have long understood how rhythm and repetition can create altered states of consciousness, build group solidarity, and make ideas feel more profound and meaningful. Chanting, responsive reading, and ceremonial timing all use musical principles to enhance spiritual experience. Perhaps the most sophisticated aspect is how conversational music can make artificial interactions feel completely natural. When the orchestration is skillful enough, participants feel like they are having spontaneous discussions while actually following a carefully composed score. The meeting felt like an organic exchange of ideas and collaborative decision-making, but every pause, every transition, every moment of emphasis had been choreographed to create that feeling while guiding participants toward predetermined conclusions. The dance of false retreat. The army appeared to be withdrawing in disorder, soldiers abandoning their positions and fleeing toward the hills. The enemy, sensing victory, pursued enthusiastically across the open ground where they became vulnerable to hidden archers and cavalry charges from concealed positions. What looked like defeat was actually the opening move of a complex trap. This was the strategy of tactical withdrawal as invitation. By appearing weak and vulnerable, the retreating force drew opponents into disadvantageous positions where they could be destroyed more easily than in direct confrontation. The false retreat turned enemy aggression into a weapon against itself. The technique works because apparent weakness triggers pursuit instincts in both military and social contexts. When opponents sense advantage, they often abandon caution and overextend themselves, creating opportunities that wouldn't exist during careful, methodical approaches. Ancient Chinese military philosophy codified this approach in strategic texts that emphasized using enemy strength against itself. The retreat that draws pursuers away from their defensive positions, the weakness that encourages overconfident attacks, the surrender that makes victors careless about their own security. But false retreat serves purposes beyond military deception. In negotiations, apparent concessions can draw opponents into positions where they reveal more of their strategy than they intended. The negotiator who seems to be giving ground may actually be gathering information for more effective counteroffers. The technique requires perfect timing and psychological understanding, The retreat must appear genuine enough to trigger pursuit, but not so convincing that it becomes actual defeat. The balance between seeming weakness and maintaining hidden strength demands extraordinary skill and nerve. Modern business competition sometimes employs similar strategies through companies that appear to be losing market share while actually consolidating resources for more effective positioning. The retreat from certain segments can precede expansion into more profitable areas. Political campaigns use tactical withdrawal when candidates appear to moderate their positions to draw opponents toward more extreme stances, then reveal the opponent's extremism while returning to their actual positions with apparent reasonableness. Perhaps the most sophisticated aspect is how false retreat can change the fundamental dynamic of conflict. Instead of meeting strength with strength, it transforms the opponent's power into the source of their own vulnerability, making victory possible through misdirection rather than direct confrontation. The fleeing soldiers were not running from battle. They were leading their enemies into one, using the appearance of defeat to create the conditions for total victory. Hunger for what never was. The advertisement described a perfect childhood that no one had actually experienced, but everyone remembered longing for. Golden afternoons spent building tree houses, family dinners where everyone laughed together, summers that stretched endlessly without worry or responsibility. The product being sold was breakfast cereal, but what was really being marketed was nostalgia for a past that existed only in collective imagination. This was the power of manufactured memory. By evoking experiences that felt like they should have happened, advertisers could create desire more powerful than any rational appeal to product benefits. People wanted to buy not just cereal but access to the golden childhood they felt they had somehow missed. The technique works because our memories are surprisingly malleable and often inaccurate. We remember the emotional essence of experiences more clearly than their specific details, making it possible to implant false memories that feel completely authentic. The advertised childhood felt real because it matched our emotional templates for what childhood should be like. Ancient epic poets understood this principle when they created stories that felt like shared cultural memories, even when they described events that never happened. The Iliad and Odyssey became part of Greek identity, not because they were historically accurate, but because they captured emotional truths about heroism, home, and human nature. But manufactured nostalgia serves purposes beyond simple marketing. Political movements often invoke golden ages that existed more in imagination than in history, promising to restore periods of prosperity and unity that never quite occurred as remembered. The false past becomes a template for future policies. The breakfast cereal advertisement didn't just describe childhood experiences. It created a sense that consumers had been cheated out of something precious and that purchasing the product could somehow recover what had been lost. The hunger was not for cereal, but for time travel. Modern social media amplifies this effect by encouraging people to curate idealized versions of their experiences, creating false memories in real time. The documented life becomes better than the lived one, generating nostalgia for experiences that were actually ordinary or difficult. The most insidious aspect is how manufactured memories can replace real ones, making people feel inadequate about their actual experiences compared to the idealized versions they've been shown. The perfect childhood that never existed becomes the standard against which all real childhoods are measured and found wanting. Perhaps the most profound impact is how hunger for false pasts can prevent appreciation of genuine presence. When people are constantly seeking experiences that match manufactured ideals, they miss the authentic moments that don't conform to advertising templates, but contain real meaning and connection. The golden childhood in the cereal commercial was more appealing than any real childhood could be, which was precisely why it was so effective at creating desire that no actual product could ever truly satisfy. The temperature of power. The boardroom was always kept slightly too cold, just enough to make people uncomfortable without being obvious about it. Executives would arrive in their business suits, confident and prepared, but within an hour they would be subtly distracted by the chill, their attention partly focused on staying warm rather than fully engaged with the discussions at hand. This was environmental manipulation for competitive advantage. By controlling the physical conditions of important meetings, the host could create subtle disadvantages for others while remaining comfortable themselves. Temperature became a tool for influencing negotiation outcomes without anyone realizing they were being manipulated. The technique works because physical discomfort affects cognitive performance in measurable ways. When people are too hot or too cold, they make faster decisions to escape the uncomfortable situation. They become more agreeable to proposals that promise resolution, and they have less mental energy available for complex analysis. Ancient Roman negotiators understood similar principles when they would schedule important meetings during the hottest part of summer days, ensuring that visiting diplomats from cooler climates would be physically uncomfortable and eager to conclude business quickly rather than engage in prolonged discussions. But temperature manipulation serves purposes beyond mere discomfort. Different thermal environments affect mood and decision-making style. Warm rooms promote social behavior and cooperative attitudes, while cool environments increase focus but can also create emotional distance between participants. The boardroom's chill was carefully calibrated. Too cold would have been noticed and adjusted. The perfect temperature was just uncomfortable enough to create subtle urgency without triggering complaints. Visitors would leave feeling like they had been treated professionally while unconsciously hurrying through their presentations. Modern psychological research confirms what intuitive leaders have long understood. Physical warmth literally makes people more trusting and generous, while cooler temperatures increase analytical thinking but reduce empathy and social connection. The environment shapes decisions in ways that feel completely natural to those affected. Restaurant designers use temperature strategically to influence customer behavior. Fast food establishments keep dining areas cool to encourage quick turnover, while upscale restaurants maintain warmer environments to promote longer stays and additional purchases. Perhaps the most sophisticated aspect is how temperature effects can be made to seem like natural preferences rather than deliberate manipulation. The host, who always feels comfortable while guests struggle with environmental conditions, appears naturally suited to leadership rather than artificially creating advantages. The cold boardroom was not a result of poor climate control. It was a carefully maintained competitive tool that gave the hosts subtle psychological advantages in every negotiation conducted within those walls. Games played in plain sight. The children's playground looked innocent enough, with swings and slides and colorful equipment arranged across the park. But watch carefully, and you could see the real games being played. Parents positioning themselves strategically to oversee their children while observing other families, gathering information about social status, parenting styles, and family dynamics through seemingly casual observation. This was surveillance disguised as community activity. The playground became a theater where adults performed their roles as caring parents while conducting complex social intelligence operations. Every interaction was simultaneously genuine childcare and strategic information gathering. The technique works because public spaces create opportunities for observation that would be impossible in private settings. People reveal their true characters when they believe they are simply going about their daily lives, unaware that their behavior is being carefully analyzed by others with specific agendas. Ancient Roman forums served similar functions, providing spaces where citizens could observe political leaders, merchants could assess potential customers, and intelligence agents could gather information about foreign visitors, all under the cover of normal civic activity. But the playground games served purposes beyond mere information gathering. They allowed parents to establish social hierarchies, identify potential allies and rivals, and position themselves within community power structures. The children's play became secondary to the adult competition occurring simultaneously. The beauty of the system was its apparent innocence. Anyone who questioned the intensive observation could be dismissed as paranoid or antisocial. After all, these were just parents watching their children play. The legitimate activity provided perfect cover for activities that would seem suspicious in other contexts. Modern suburban communities often develop similar dynamics around school events, youth sports, and neighborhood gatherings. The ostensible focus on children's welfare masks, complex adult social maneuvering that can determine everything from property values to political influence. Social media has amplified these dynamics by making playground-style observation possible on a much larger scale. People can now monitor their social networks continuously, gathering intelligence about relationships, career moves, and personal developments while appearing to simply maintain friendships. Perhaps the most insidious aspect is how the games corrupt the genuine activities they use as cover. Real childcare becomes performative, authentic community building gets replaced by strategic positioning, and innocent social gatherings transform into competitive intelligence operations. The playground's colorful equipment was exactly what it appeared to be, but the real games being played there had nothing to do with children and everything to do with the complex social chess match that adults conduct whenever they gather in seemingly innocent public spaces. The gravity of absence. The empty chair at the board meeting commanded more attention than any of the occupied ones. Everyone knew whose seat it was, why it remained vacant, and what the absence signified about the ongoing power struggle within the organization. The missing person's influence filled the room more completely than their presence ever had. This was the technique of strategic withdrawal, using absence as a form of communication more powerful than any speech. By choosing not to participate, the absent board member was making a statement that dominated the entire meeting, forcing others to interpret their silence and react to their invisible presence. The technique works because absence creates uncertainty and speculation that presence cannot match. When someone is physically present, their position is clear from their words and actions. When they are absent, others must guess at their motivations, fears, and intentions, often attributing more significance to their absence than the situation actually warrants. Ancient Chinese diplomatic protocol included elaborate systems of meaningful absence. Officials would skip certain ceremonies to signal displeasure, arrive late to indicate the relative importance they assigned to different relationships, or leave early to demonstrate that their attention was required elsewhere on more pressing matters. But strategic absence serves purposes beyond mere protest or communication. It can force others to make decisions without crucial input, creating opportunities to later challenge those decisions as illegitimate or uninformed. The absent person retains clean hands while others must take responsibility for potentially controversial actions. The empty chair also changes the dynamic among those who remain present. Without the missing person's voice, different opinions emerge, new alliances form, and conversations take directions that would have been impossible with full attendance. Absence reshapes presence in unpredictable ways. Modern political systems often see strategic withdrawal through boycotts, walkouts, and refusals to participate in processes that are perceived as illegitimate. The absence becomes a form of protest that can be more effective than active opposition because it questions the validity of the entire proceeding. The timing of strategic absence affects its impact. Missing routine meetings carries little weight, but being absent from crucial decisions sends strong messages about the absent person's priorities and allegiances. The more important the occasion, the more meaningful the absence becomes. Perhaps the most sophisticated aspect is how strategic absence can maintain power while avoiding responsibility. The person who is not present cannot be blamed for outcomes they did not directly influence, yet their absence may have shaped those outcomes more than anyone else's participation. The empty chair spoke volumes without saying a word, turning absence into presence and silence into the loudest voice in the room. Scars that tell stories. The general wore his military decorations proudly, but the small scar above his left eyebrow carried more weight than any medal. Veterans in the audience would notice it immediately, recognizing the mark of close combat, the badge of someone who had shared their dangers rather than observing them from safe distances. This was the power of visible sacrifice, the way physical marks could communicate experiences that words could never adequately describe. The scar was not just evidence of past injury, but proof of present credibility, a credential that could not be faked or awarded by committees. The technique works because authenticity is increasingly rare and valuable in a world of manufactured images and carefully curated presentations. People hunger for signs of genuine experience, real struggle, actual sacrifice. The scar provides that authenticity in a form that cannot be disputed or replicated. Ancient cultures often marked their warriors, priests, and leaders with tattoos, scarification, or ritual modifications that indicated their rank, achievements, and spiritual journey. These physical markers created immediate recognition of status and experience that required no verbal explanation or documentary proof. But scars serve purposes beyond mere credibility. They create bonds between those who share similar marks, instant recognition of common experience that transcends other social boundaries. Combat veterans recognize each other's scars, understanding the stories they represent without needing detailed explanations. The general's scar also served as a form of controlled vulnerability. By displaying evidence of past injury, he demonstrated both strength and humanity. The mark showed that he could be hurt, which paradoxically made him seem stronger because he had survived and continued serving despite the damage. Modern leadership often lacks such clear physical markers of experience and sacrifice. Business executives, political leaders, and cultural figures must find other ways to demonstrate their credentials and build trust with audiences who have learned to be skeptical of purely verbal claims. The timing of scar revelation can affect its impact. Scars displayed too obviously seem performative, while those discovered accidentally carry more weight because they appear to be genuine rather than calculated attempts at image management. Perhaps the most profound aspect is how scars can transform past pain into present power. The injury that once represented vulnerability becomes a source of strength. The damage that could have destroyed becomes the foundation for greater resilience and credibility. The small mark above the general's eyebrow told a story more convincing than any biography, creating trust and respect through the simple presence of evidence that he had paid prices others had not. The alchemy of attention. The street performer played his violin with extraordinary skill, drawing crowds of appreciative listeners who dropped coins into his open case. But the real magic happened when he stopped playing. The sudden silence created a vacuum that people felt compelled to fill, either by applauding, making donations, or engaging in conversations they wouldn't have started while the music continued. This was the strategic use of attention economics. By controlling when he provided and withdrew his performance, the musician could manipulate the audience's emotional state and behavioral responses. The pause became more powerful than the playing, turning attention into a resource that could be deployed for maximum psychological impact. The technique works because attention is finite and precious. When someone captures our focus completely, then suddenly withdraws it, we experience a kind of psychological whiplash that creates urgency and desire for restoration. The absence of stimulus becomes more noticeable than its presence had been. Ancient Roman gladiators understood this principle when they would pause during combat to acknowledge the crowd, creating moments of suspended tension that made the subsequent action feel more dramatic and meaningful. The pause heightened the spectacle more than continuous action could have achieved. But attention economics extends beyond entertainment into all forms of human interaction. The teacher who uses silence to regain classroom control, the negotiator who creates pauses to increase pressure, the speaker who lets important points hang in the air before continuing, all employ similar principles. The street musician's strategy also demonstrated understanding of social psychology. When people gather around a performer, they become part of a temporary community. The shared experience creates social pressure to participate through applause or donations, making individual responses feel like group obligations. Modern digital platforms have weaponized attention economics through algorithms designed to capture and hold user focus, then strategically withdraw content to create addiction-like cycles of engagement. The intermittent reinforcement of social media notifications operates on the same principles as the musician's strategic silences. The timing of attention withdrawal affects its power. Too brief, and people don't notice the absence. Too long, and they lose interest entirely. The perfect pause creates just enough emptiness to generate desire for restoration without allowing attention to drift elsewhere. Perhaps the most sophisticated aspect is how attention manipulation can make people feel grateful for ordinary experiences. The musician's return to playing after silence felt like a gift, even though continuous music was what the audience originally expected. The violin's silence was more valuable than its song, creating psychological conditions that transformed casual listeners into invested participants in the performer's economic survival. Paths that lead nowhere. The garden maze was designed with multiple false paths that would lead visitors in circles past the same fountains and flower beds, creating the illusion of progress while actually returning them to their starting points. Only one route led to the center, but finding it required recognizing when apparent advancement was actually elaborate deception. This was the architecture of controlled confusion. By creating the appearance of multiple options while actually limiting choice, the maze designer could guide visitors' experiences while maintaining the illusion of freedom and exploration. The false paths serve the real path by making its discovery feel like genuine achievement. The technique works because people assume that effort leads to progress, that following paths will result in destinations, that persistence will be rewarded with success. The maze exploits these assumptions by creating elaborate systems that consume energy without producing the expected results. Ancient philosophical schools often employed similar methods in their teaching, presenting students with logical puzzles and intellectual challenges that had no solutions, designed to exhaust conventional thinking approaches and prepare minds for different ways of understanding reality. But false paths serve purposes beyond mere frustration or education. They can be used to waste opponents' time and resources, directing energy toward unproductive activities, while real objectives are pursued through hidden routes. The visible path becomes a distraction from the invisible one. Modern bureaucratic systems often function like institutional mazes, with complex procedures that appear to lead toward resolution, but actually cycle through endless requirements and referrals. The system maintains legitimacy through the appearance of process while avoiding actual decision-making. The garden maze's false paths also created valuable psychological effects for those who eventually found the true route. The struggle and confusion made success feel more meaningful when it finally arrived. The difficulty justified the destination, making the center feel worth reaching. Corporate hierarchies sometimes employ similar structures through promotion paths that appear to lead toward authority but actually cycle through lateral positions without real advancement. The appearance of career progression masks systems designed to maintain existing power structures. Perhaps the most insidious aspect is how false paths can consume entire lifetimes without their victims recognizing the deception. People can spend decades following routes that were never intended to reach meaningful destinations, mistaking motion for progress. The maze's beauty disguised its cruelty, offering the promise of discovery while delivering the reality of endless circular wandering through paths that were designed to lead nowhere at all. The texture of consensus. The committee meeting felt remarkably harmonious. Everyone seemed to agree on the major decisions, voices blended in apparent unity, and conflicts were resolved with surprising ease. Only later did members realize that their consensus had been carefully orchestrated through strategic seating arrangements, agenda sequencing, and information management that made disagreement feel impossible. This was manufactured agreement, the creation of false consensus through environmental and procedural manipulation. By controlling the conditions under which discussions occurred, the meeting facilitator could guide groups toward predetermined conclusions while maintaining the appearance of democratic decision-making. The technique works because people want to belong to harmonious groups and avoid being seen as disruptive or unreasonable. When the social environment suggests that consensus is emerging, individuals feel pressure to join the majority rather than stand alone in opposition. The appearance of agreement creates the reality of agreement. Ancient Greek city-states employed similar methods in their assemblies, using architectural arrangements and speaking order to influence how citizens perceived the relative strength of different positions. The physical and procedural environment could make minority views seem isolated and majority positions appear inevitable. But manufactured consensus serves purposes beyond simple manipulation. It can help groups overcome genuine paralysis by providing frameworks for decision-making when natural agreement is impossible. Sometimes artificial consensus is better than genuine gridlock. The committee's harmony was achieved through subtle techniques. Dissenting members were seated away from each other to prevent alliance formation. Popular proposals were presented first to create momentum for agreement. Information was selectively shared to make preferred options seem obviously superior. Modern political polling often employs similar methods by framing questions in ways that guide respondents toward desired answers, then presenting the results as authentic public opinion. The manufactured consensus becomes the basis for policy decisions that claim democratic legitimacy. Corporate team-building exercises frequently use consensus manufacturing techniques to create the appearance of workplace harmony and shared commitment to company objectives. The artificial agreement feels real to participants who mistake orchestrated unity for genuine collaboration. Perhaps the most dangerous aspect is how manufactured consensus can silence legitimate dissent by making opposition feel antisocial rather than principled. When everyone appears to agree, disagreement becomes personally costly rather than intellectually honest. The committee members left feeling satisfied with their collaborative decision-making, unaware that their consensus had been as carefully manufactured as any industrial product, designed to feel authentic while serving purposes they had never consciously considered. Shadows behind the throne. The king made all the public decisions, signed all the official documents, received all the credit and blame for policy outcomes. But in the private chambers behind the throne room, his sister quietly managed the information he received, the advisors he consulted, and the options he believed were available to him. This was the power of invisible influence, control exercised through information management rather than direct authority. By shaping what the king knew and how he understood it, his sister could guide his decisions without ever appearing to challenge his authority or compromise his dignity. The technique works because decision-makers can only choose from options they perceive, based on information they possess, filtered through frameworks they accept as valid. By controlling any of these elements, someone without official power can exercise more real influence than those with formal authority. Ancient Chinese imperial courts developed sophisticated systems of information control, where eunuch administrators and court scholars could shape policy through their management of documents, scheduling of audiences, and framing of issues presented to emperors who believed they were making independent decisions. But invisible influence serves purposes beyond mere power-seeking. It can protect leaders from information overload, shield them from political damage, and allow them to maintain public positions that would be impossible if they were seen as personally responsible for controversial decisions. The king's sister operated through networks of relationships rather than chains of command. She cultivated loyalty among servants, clerks, and minor officials who controlled the flow of information and access to the king. Her power came from being indispensable rather than irreplaceable. Modern political systems still feature similar dynamics through chiefs of staff, senior advisors, and informal counselors who shape what leaders see and how they understand it. The invisible influence can be more significant than any cabinet position or formal role. Corporate structures often include similar shadow hierarchies where executive assistants, long-term employees, or trusted confidants exercise influence through their control of access, information, and interpretation of company dynamics that formal leaders may not fully understand. Perhaps the most sophisticated aspect is how invisible influence can make leaders more effective by protecting them from political costs while ensuring better decision-making through careful information, curation, and strategic option presentation. The king's authority was real and substantial, but it operated within boundaries that his sister had carefully constructed through years of patient work in the shadows behind his throne. The weight of empty praise. The annual performance review was filled with glowing comments about dedication, teamwork, and positive attitude. Every paragraph contained superlatives. Every assessment praised exceptional commitment and valuable contributions. Yet somehow, reading through all this praise felt hollow, meaningless, like eating a meal with no nutritional content. This was the technique of valueless validation, praise so generic and universal that it communicated nothing meaningful about actual performance or genuine appreciation. By inflating language beyond any connection to reality, the reviewer had made compliments worthless while maintaining the appearance of recognition. The technique works because people initially respond positively to praise, regardless of its specific content or accuracy. The emotional lift of being complimented feels good in the moment, making it difficult to immediately recognize when the praise carries no substantive meaning or genuine assessment. Ancient Roman political rhetoric included elaborate systems of formulaic praise that senators would deploy to acknowledge colleagues without actually committing to any specific positions about their competence or achievements. The empty praise fulfilled social obligations without creating political risks. But valueless validation serves purposes beyond mere politeness. It allows organizations to appear supportive and appreciative while avoiding the difficulty of making honest assessments that might require uncomfortable conversations or actual changes in policy or behavior. The performance review's effusive language also protected the reviewer from criticism. Anyone who complained about receiving such positive feedback would seem ungrateful and unreasonable. The empty praise became a shield against accountability for more substantive evaluation. Modern customer service and marketing communications often employ similar techniques through automated responses and template messages that express enthusiasm and appreciation without any connection to actual customer experiences or specific service quality. The most insidious aspect of empty praise is how it can devalue genuine recognition when it does occur. When people become accustomed to meaningless compliments, they lose the ability to distinguish between authentic appreciation and formulaic validation, making real feedback less effective and meaningful. Educational systems sometimes use grade inflation and participation trophies in ways that create similar effects, providing recognition that feels positive but carries no information about actual achievement or areas for improvement, ultimately serving neither students nor the educational process. Perhaps the most tragic element is how empty praise can prevent the genuine recognition that people actually crave. When organizations substitute meaningless compliments for authentic appreciation of specific contributions, they satisfy neither the human need for validation nor the practical need for useful feedback. The glowing performance review felt worse than criticism because it demonstrated that the reviewer had no real understanding of or interest in the employee's actual work, reducing their efforts to generic templates that could apply to anyone or no one. Rivers changed by pebbles. The massive river had carved its path through the landscape for thousands of years, its course seemingly permanent and unchangeable. Yet a small group of engineers managed to alter its direction, not through dramatic intervention, but by placing carefully chosen rocks at strategic points where tiny changes in flow would accumulate over time into major shifts in the water's path. This was the power of accumulated minor influence. Instead of attempting dramatic changes that would trigger resistance and likely failure, the engineers worked with natural forces and existing patterns, making small adjustments that grew into significant transformations through patience and strategic thinking. The technique works because systems are often more vulnerable to gentle, persistent pressure than to sudden force. The river that would resist a dam might gradually accept new channels carved by strategically placed obstacles that work with its flow rather than against it. Ancient Chinese water management employed similar principles, using small diversions and gradual modifications to redirect entire river systems over generations. The changes were so gradual that each generation inherited what felt like natural waterways, unaware of the human engineering that had shaped them. But incremental influence extends far beyond physical systems into social and political realms. Cultural changes often occur through accumulation of small shifts in language, behavior, and expectation rather than through dramatic revolutions or sudden policy changes. The river engineers understood that timing was crucial to their strategy. The rocks had to be placed when water levels were appropriate, seasonal flows were predictable, and environmental conditions would support the gradual changes they hoped to achieve. Modern social movements often employ similar strategies through sustained campaigns that gradually shift public opinion, change institutional practices, and alter cultural norms through persistent but non-confrontational pressure applied at strategic points in social systems. Corporate culture transformations frequently work through similar principles, with small changes in hiring practices, meeting structures, and communication patterns accumulating over time into major shifts in organizational behavior and values. Perhaps the most profound aspect is how incremental change can become irreversible once it reaches certain tipping points. The river that has carved a new channel cannot easily be forced back to its original path, making gradual influence potentially more permanent than dramatic intervention. The engineer's small stones accomplished what massive dams could never have achieved, proving that persistence and strategic thinking can be more powerful than force when working with natural patterns rather than against them. The science of suggestion. The doctor's office was carefully designed to promote healing through environmental psychology. Soft blues and greens dominated the color scheme, reducing anxiety and promoting calm. The lighting was warm but not bright, creating a sense of comfort without causing eye strain. Even the background music was selected at specific frequencies known to reduce stress hormones. This was influenced through sensory manipulation, the systematic use of environmental cues to guide emotional and physiological responses. Every element in the space had been chosen not for aesthetic appeal, but for its measurable effect on patient psychology and recovery rates. The technique works because our bodies and minds respond to environmental stimuli in predictable ways that operate below conscious awareness. Colors affect mood, sounds influence heart rate, scents trigger memory and emotional responses. By controlling these variables, practitioners can create psychological states that support their objectives. Ancient Egyptian temple architecture employed similar principles, using specific proportions, lighting effects, and acoustic properties to create spiritual experiences that felt divine, but were actually the result of careful environmental engineering designed to awe and inspire worshippers. But environmental suggestion serves purposes beyond mere comfort or atmosphere. Medical research has demonstrated that recovery times, pain perception, and treatment compliance all improve in carefully designed healing environments that support the body's natural recovery processes. The doctor's office also included subtle social proof elements. Awards and certificates were displayed prominently, but not ostentatiously, suggesting competence without appearing boastful. Patient testimonials were positioned where they would be noticed, but not intrusive, building confidence in the treatment approach. Modern retail environments use similar techniques through lighting that makes merchandise appear more attractive, music that influences shopping pace and purchase decisions, and scent marketing that creates positive associations with brands and products. Restaurant design employs environmental suggestion through color schemes that stimulate appetite, seating arrangements that encourage desired dining durations, and acoustic treatments that create appropriate ambiance for different types of dining experiences. Perhaps the most sophisticated aspect is how environmental suggestion can enhance the effectiveness of other interventions. The medical treatment may work better when delivered in an environment that supports patient confidence, relaxation, and positive expectation. The doctor's carefully designed office was not just a pleasant place to receive care. It was a therapeutic tool that began working on patients before any formal treatment commenced, using environmental psychology to improve outcomes through the science of sensory influence. Dreams sold as truth. The late-night infomercial painted a picture of effortless success that felt almost within reach. Ordinary people testimonied about their extraordinary transformations. Before and after photos documented dramatic changes, and compelling statistics supported claims about life-altering results. The product being sold was secondary to the dream of becoming someone different, someone better, someone finally living the life they deserved. This was the marketing of aspiration, selling not products but identity transformations. The infomercial understood that people don't buy goods and services as much as they buy better versions of themselves, improved futures that seem possible if only they make the right purchase decision. The technique works because everyone carries a gap between their current reality and their ideal self-image. The dream feels achievable because it addresses real desires for change, improvement, and fulfillment. The product becomes a bridge between who people are and who they want to become. Ancient religious movements often employed similar approaches, offering not just spiritual teachings, but complete identity transformations. Conversion promised to make people fundamentally different, better, more connected to divine purpose than their previous selves had been. But selling dreams serves purposes beyond simple commerce. It taps into deep human needs for growth, meaning, and self-actualization. The aspiration may be more valuable than the product, providing hope and motivation even when material results disappoint. The infomercial's testimonials were carefully selected to represent diverse demographics while maintaining consistent themes about transformation and satisfaction. The before and after comparisons created visual proof of possibility that bypassed rational skepticism about dramatic change. Modern social media influencers use similar techniques by presenting curated versions of their lives that appear achievable but require purchasing the products, services, or experiences they promote. The aspirational lifestyle becomes the real product being marketed. Political campaigns often sell dreams of national transformation, promising that voting for specific candidates will lead to better versions of society that fulfill voters' deepest hopes for their communities and country. Perhaps the most insidious aspect is how dream marketing can prevent people from appreciating their current circumstances by constantly focusing attention on what they lack rather than what they possess. The perpetual pursuit of transformation becomes its own form of dissatisfaction. The infomercial's product may or may not have delivered its promised benefits, but the dream it sold was always real, powerful, and ultimately more valuable than any physical merchandise could ever be. The final whisper. The old woman's voice had grown soft over the years, barely audible above the ambient sounds of daily life. Yet when she spoke, everyone in the room would unconsciously lean forward, strain to catch her words, hang on every syllable, as if it might be her last. Her whisper had become more compelling than any shout, her quiet words carrying weight that loud proclamations could never achieve. This was the ultimate influence of scarcity and fragility. When communication becomes precious because it is limited, every word gains value far beyond its simple meaning. The whisper that might be missed becomes more important than the speech that cannot be ignored. The technique works because we assign greater value to what we must work to obtain. The words that require effort to hear feel more significant than those delivered with ease. The old woman's physical limitations had transformed her speech into a rare resource that people competed to access. Ancient oracles often spoke in whispers or mumbles that required interpretation, making their pronouncements feel more profound because listeners had to participate actively in understanding their meaning. The difficulty of reception became proof of the message's importance. But the power of the final whisper extends beyond mere vocal limitations. It represents the influence that comes from being perceived as having limited time, finite resources, or irreplaceable knowledge. Scarcity creates urgency and attention that abundance cannot match. The old woman's whisper also carried the weight of accumulated experience, the sense that her words had been distilled through decades of living into only the most essential truths worth sharing. Her silence had become as meaningful as her speech. Modern digital communication has created new forms of whisper influence through limited-time content, exclusive access, and messages that disappear after viewing. The temporary nature of the communication makes it feel more valuable and urgent. Perhaps the most profound aspect is how the final whisper reminds us that all influence is temporary, all voices eventually fade, all power ultimately passes to others. The whisper acknowledges its own fragility while using that fragility as its source of strength. In recognizing the old woman's whisper as powerful, we recognize something essential about influence itself. The most lasting impact often comes not from those who shout the loudest, but from those who understand when to speak softly and make others choose to listen. Her whisper will fade, as all voices do. But in the brief moment when people lean forward to catch her words, she demonstrates the final lesson about influence, that true power lies not in forcing attention, but in making attention feel like a privilege freely chosen. And in that choice, in that leaning forward, in that moment of voluntary listening, we see perhaps the most honest form of influence that exists between human beings. Not manipulation, not coercion, not trickery, but simply the recognition that some voices, however quiet, deserve to be heard. The final whisper fades into silence, leaving only the choice to remember or forget, to carry forward or let go, to honor the influence or allow it to disappear. In that choice lies the ultimate test of whether influence was genuine or merely performance, whether it touched something real or simply created temporary illusion. The old woman's voice grows quieter still, and we lean closer, knowing that what we hear now may be all we ever get, and that perhaps, in the end, that is enough. Influence has always moved quietly, through whispers, silences, gestures, and symbols. History shows us that power is rarely loud. It slips in unnoticed, shaping choices we believe are our own. These tactics remind us that persuasion is everywhere, often invisible, often delicate, yet profoundly effective. Thank you for spending these hours with me exploring how subtle influence shaped the world. If you found these stories thought-provoking, I'd love for you to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment with the tactic that surprised you most, and share this with someone who enjoys looking at history through a different lens. Your support helps us bring more journeys like this to life.